When we think of World War II, we picture brave soldiers in the heat of battle. We see images of courage under fire, of men fighting for their lives against a human enemy. But there was another enemy on the battlefield, one that didn't carry a rifle or wear a uniform. This enemy was nature itself. Imagine being a young soldier, thousands of miles from home. You've survived the day's fighting, the sounds of explosions finally fading into the distance. You crawl into your thin canvas tent, hoping for a few hours of precious sleep. Then, the sky opens up. The wind howls like a wolf, and the rain comes down not in drops, but in solid sheets, turning the ground into a river of mud and misery. For countless soldiers, the worst nights were not the ones filled with combat, but the ones spent fighting a storm. A violent tempest could be more terrifying than an ambush. The wind would tear at their flimsy shelters, threatening to rip them from their moorings and leave the men exposed to the freezing rain or biting snow. These storms were relentless. They didn't care about battle lines or ceasefires. They attacked with a brutal force that could break a man's spirit faster than any enemy soldier. A soldier could fight back against a man, but how do you fight back against a hurricane-force wind or a blizzard that buries everything in a blanket of white? This was a different kind of war, a war of survival against the elements. These men were already pushed to their limits, physically and mentally exhausted from the constant stress of war. A night spent battling a storm was a night without rest, a night that drained their energy and left them cold, wet, and vulnerable. The next morning, they would have to face the enemy again, but they would be starting the day already defeated by the weather. They would be shivering, their gear soaked, their bodies aching from the cold that had seeped into their bones. It was in these moments of pure, raw survival that the soldiers learned a hard and vital lesson. Sometimes, the greatest threat isn't the one you can see coming over the hill, but the one that falls from the sky. The stories from the front lines are filled with these accounts. Veterans would speak of nights where the thunder was louder than the artillery, where tents collapsed and flooded, forcing them to stand in knee-deep, freezing water until dawn. They would recall waking up to find their shelter gone, blown away in the night, with nothing but the angry gray sky above them. This constant battle with nature taught them that their standard issue gear was not always enough. They had to get smarter. They had to learn from the land itself. Their very survival depended not just on their training as soldiers, but on their ability to become masters of the wild. The standard military tent of World War II was a simple thing, made of canvas pulled over a few poles. In fair weather, it offered a basic shield from the sun and a bit of privacy. It was a small piece of civilization in the middle of chaos. But when a real storm hit, that simple tent became worse than useless. It became a liability. The canvas, once it became saturated with rain, grew incredibly heavy. This weight put immense strain on the poles and ropes, which were often the first things to fail. A snapped pole or a ripped guy line was all it took for the entire structure to come crashing down, often in the middle of the night, trapping the soldiers underneath a heavy, wet blanket. The problems didn't stop there. Even if the tent managed to stay upright, it was a poor defense against the cold and wet. Canvas is not waterproof by modern standards. Rain would seep through the fabric, dripping constantly on the soldiers and their equipment. The ground beneath them would turn to mud, and soon the inside of the tent would be a cold, swampy mess. The thin material offered almost no insulation. The wind would cut right through it, stealing precious body heat and leaving the men inside shivering uncontrollably. A wet soldier is a cold soldier, and a cold soldier is at risk of hypothermia, a silent killer on the battlefield that claimed many lives. Furthermore, these above-ground shelters were a massive risk in a combat zone. A tent stands out against the landscape. It creates a clear silhouette, making it an obvious target for enemy artillery, mortars, and snipers. From a distance, a cluster of tents told the enemy exactly where to aim. They were beacons that screamed, "Soldiers are sleeping here." This visibility turned what should have been a safe haven into a dangerous bullseye. Soldiers trying to get some rest were constantly aware that their shelter made them a target. adding a layer of psychological stress to the physical discomfort. The very thing meant to protect them was putting them in greater danger. Ultimately, the tent failed because it fought against nature instead of working with it. It tried to stand up against the wind, which only made it easier for the wind to tear it down. It tried to sit on top of the wet ground, which only guaranteed it would flood. It was a fragile, man-made structure in a world of overwhelming natural power. Soldiers quickly realized that to survive the storm and the enemy, they couldn't rely on something so flimsy. They needed a shelter that was stronger, warmer, and invisible. They needed to stop trying to build on the earth and start building with it. Faced with collapsing tents and the constant threat of enemy eyes, soldiers discovered a powerful secret that has been used by survivalists for centuries. The answer wasn't to build higher, but to dig lower. They learned to create a shelter by digging directly into the ground. This wasn't just a simple foxhole for fighting, it was a carefully constructed temporary home designed for survival. The basic principle was brilliantly simple. First, they would dig a trench or a rectangular hole in the ground, deep enough for a man to lie down in comfortably, usually about 2 to 3 feet deep. This simple act immediately got them out of the wind. The soil that they excavated wasn't discarded. It was a crucial part of the construction. They would pile this earth around the edges of the hole, creating a thick, low wall known as a berm. This berm acted as a primary windbreak, deflecting the strongest gusts of wind up and over the shelter instead of letting them blast directly into it. Already, even without a roof, a soldier lying in this trench was far more protected from the wind chill than he would have been in a tent. He was using the very mass of the planet as his shield, a defense far stronger than any piece of canvas could ever be. The next step was to build a roof. Using whatever materials they could find, soldiers would lay a framework of strong branches or logs across the top of the trench. They would place these supports close together to create a solid base. Over this wooden frame, they would lay down their poncho or a piece of canvas to act as a waterproof layer. This was a critical step to keep the inside of the shelter dry. The genius of the design, however, came last. On top of the waterproof layer, they piled back the remaining soil, leaves, and sod, creating a thick, heavy roof of pure earth. This simple, dug-in shelter, often called a bivvy or a dugout, was a game-changer. It was low profile, almost invisible from a distance, hiding the soldiers from the enemy. It was incredibly strong, able to withstand winds that would have shredded a tent to ribbons. The heavy earth roof held everything in place, and the semi-underground position meant it couldn't be blown over. The soldiers had stopped fighting the environment and had started using its own materials to create a fortress. They had learned a fundamental rule of survival: don't fight the storm, go under it. The reason this dugout shelter worked so well comes down to some very basic science. The Earth is a fantastic insulator. Air temperature can swing wildly, dropping dozens of degrees in a matter of hours. The ground, however, holds its temperature much more consistently. Just a couple of feet below the surface, the Earth maintains a relatively stable temperature, warmer than the freezing air in winter and cooler than the baking air in summer. By digging down, the soldiers were tapping into this natural temperature regulation. They were surrounding themselves with a massive, stable thermal mass that protected them from the extreme fluctuations of the air. This underground protection did two things. First, it blocked the wind completely. Wind is a major factor in heat loss. It strips warmth away from your body through a process called convection. Even if the air temperature is just above freezing, a strong wind can make it feel much, much colder, a phenomenon known as wind chill. In a tent, you are still exposed to wind chill as it presses against the thin fabric. In a dugout, you are completely shielded. The ground doesn't let any wind through. This alone makes a massive difference in your ability to stay warm and conserve precious energy. Second, the earth helped trap the soldier's own body heat. A human body is like a small furnace, constantly generating warmth. In a tent, that heat rises and escapes easily through the thin walls and roof. In a well-built dugout, that heat is trapped. The thick earth roof and walls act like a blanket, reflecting the warmth back towards the soldier. The small enclosed space would quickly warm up from a single person's body heat, creating a microclimate that was significantly warmer than the outside world. This meant soldiers could stay warm with less bedding and without needing a fire, which would have given away their position. The psychological effect was just as important. Being inside one of these shelters felt incredibly safe and secure. While a storm raged outside, with winds howling and rain or snow lashing down, the soldier inside was in a quiet, still, and relatively warm cocoon. The sounds of the storm were muffled by the thick layer of earth. This sense of security allowed for deep, restorative sleep, which was vital for a soldier's physical and mental recovery. The earth wasn't just a building material, it became a guardian, providing a level of protection and comfort that a flimsy tent could never hope to match. One of the greatest strengths of the dugout shelter was its adaptability. Soldiers were deployed to every corner of the globe, from the frozen forests of Belgium to the muddy fields of France and the rocky islands of the Pacific. The basic design of the dugout could be modified to work in almost any environment. On the Eastern Front, or during the Battle of the Bulge, soldiers faced deep snow and frozen ground. Digging was incredibly difficult, but they adapted. They would use snow itself as a building material, piling it up to create thick walls for insulation, similar to how an igloo works. The roof would still be made of logs and earth, with a deep layer of snow added on top for extra warmth. In perpetually muddy and wet areas, digging a deep hole could mean creating a pit that would quickly fill with water. Here, soldiers learned to build semi-dugouts. They would only dig down a foot or so, and then build the walls up higher using logs, rocks, or sandbags filled with mud. They would often dig a small drainage channel around the perimeter of the shelter to divert rainwater away and keep the inside dry. In heavily forested areas, they had an abundance of materials. They could build robust log roofs and use thick layers of pine needles and leaf litter for insulation, both inside the shelter and on top of the roof. The design was also adapted for different battlefield conditions. A simple one-man ranger grave could be dug in less than an hour, providing immediate protection from an unexpected storm or bombardment. For more established positions, squads would work together to build larger, more elaborate dugouts that could house several men. These might include camouflaged entrances, ventilation shafts made from hollow logs, and even small, smokeless stoves vented through a concealed pipe. Every detail was about maximizing safety, warmth, and concealment, using only what the local environment provided. This ability to adapt is a core principle of survival. It's not about having one perfect plan, but about understanding the principles and applying them to your specific situation. The soldiers weren't following a blueprint from a manual, they were innovating on the fly. They looked at the ground beneath their feet, the trees around them, and the weather above them, and they figured out the best way to use those elements to their advantage. This creativity and resourcefulness, born from desperation, turned a simple hole in the ground into the most reliable and effective shelter in the war. The incredible lesson from these WWII soldiers is not just a piece of history. It's a practical survival skill that anyone can learn and use today. If you ever find yourself lost in the wilderness, caught in a surprise blizzard or a severe thunderstorm, the principles of the dugout shelter can save your life. Modern tents and high-tech gear are great, but they can fail. Batteries die, fabrics rip, and gear can get lost. Understanding how to create shelter from the natural landscape is the ultimate backup plan. The earth is always there, and knowing how to use it is a skill that weighs nothing to carry. To build a basic emergency shelter today, you follow the same simple steps. Find a spot of ground, preferably a natural depression or the base of a small hill, which is well drained. Use a sturdy stick, a rock, or your hands to dig a trench just big enough for your body. Pile the dirt you remove around the edges to form a windbreak. Next, find fallen branches to lay across the top as a roof structure. Cover this frame with whatever you have, a poncho, a jacket, or even layers of broad leaves and bark. Finally, pile dirt, leaves, and moss on top to insulate and weigh it down. In just an hour or two, you can create a shelter that will keep you much warmer and drier than huddling under a tree. This old trick works because it respects the power of nature. It doesn't try to defy the wind and cold. It uses the insulating properties of the earth to escape them. It's a lesson in humility. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the most ancient one. Real survival isn't about having the most expensive gear or the latest gadget. It's about knowledge. It's about looking at a fallen log and seeing a roof beam, looking at a pile of leaves and seeing insulation, and looking at the ground and seeing a safe place to rest. This mindset is more valuable than any piece of equipment you can buy. So the next time you head into the outdoors, remember the forgotten hack of those WWII soldiers. Respect the weather and have a backup plan. The most important survival tool you will ever have is your own ingenuity and the knowledge of how to work with nature, not against it. In the end, the earth itself provides the best shelter. You just have to know how to ask for it. That is a lesson learned in the harshest of conditions, a lesson that is as true today as it was on the battlefields of the past.